Well, we might get underway. Three very, very different presentations and lots of rich food for thought there. We have got about half an hour, if we can consume it, to explore the presentations and the issues associated with them in a bit more detail. We do have a microphone roaming, so a couple of microphones roaming. So can I ask, please, that when you want to ask a question, that you wait for the microphone to come so we can capture it for YouTube and all the rest of that and posterity. And it might be helpful also if you could remember to say who you are and if you've got a particular interest before asking the question. It's always useful to declare that. Just by way of getting underway, perhaps I might exercise the rights as the MC and ask the first question. And it's actually for Al. You talked about the fusion cells evolving as a response to an operational imperative. So lots of change there and innovation required. Despite the operational imperative, it's still change. So was there institutional resistance, cultural resistance to the changes that you talked about?
No, not really. Nothing that I would say be terribly significant. And that may be because of the experience of the SOM, that everybody realized that we have to just try something different, that the imperative was so great. But yes, no, I'm not aware of too much or really any significant degree of pushback against the idea of establishing the CBSOs and also providing them with such quite enormous responsibility and also access to so many assets that technically they didn't own, but yet everybody willingly cooperated with them. So no, I think the development, the transition to it was relatively smooth, and once it was used for the first time, it then became self-reinforcing. So once it was proven as a good idea, then it rapidly became institutionalized. That being said, of course, when the war came to an end, they all rapidly disappeared, and the whole concept of counter battery had to be reinvented for the next war.
Thank you. Well, now over to the floor. We start with Paul Stevens.
Thanks, Jim. I'm Paul Stevens. Al, can I ask you another question? Have you looked on the other side of the hill to see if the Central Powers, the German forces, produced a similar organisation for the same imperatives?
Yeah, I have looked at it, and no, they don't. Now they have access to most of the same technologies. They have sound ranging and flash spotting and artillery observation planes and all those. But in part, the problem is that their artillery is organized somewhat differently, with a greater emphasis on the divisional responsibility and then also army responsibility. So the Corps doesn't play the same kind of role in the two armies. Plus, there are also other technical problems that are gradually forcing them, particularly when you get into 1918, because the quality of their guns starts to decline, and they're not able to replace them as often as they should have. So accuracy is declining, but it's mainly organizational. And yes, they do collect the information, but it's not processed in the same way and used in the same way. And so it's really one of the missed opportunities, and mainly because it just doesn't nest in the right place.
Thank you. Mark Schweikert, former artillery intelligence officer many years ago. I'm currently director of test and evaluation in VCDF Group, or ADF headquarters now. You mentioned that, I think in your speech, that the Germans actually used gas for the first time in a counter-battery role. Is that correct?
What was you?
Right, sorry.
No, it wasn't the first time they used gas, it was the first time they used mustard gas.
Must.
Yeah, and it was designed for much the same reason that Al was saying. It's an area effect weapon, and trying to engage dispersed batteries, it's much easier with gas than... I mean, the other alternative was people don't realise, but there was a reinvigoration of shrapnel in 1918 as a suppressive weapon to try and neutralise rather than destroy batteries. But no, the Germans went down the chemical path as an area effect weapon, if you will.
So you said that was the first use, though. So
it was the first use of gas, of mustard gas,
against a battery. Against
artillery. They'd used, I mean, plenty of chlorine and tear gas and other sort of lacrimonious, that's tear gas, other sorts of gas measures. But the first use of mustard on the Western Front was against the Allied artillery in Passchendaele.
Thank you.
Thank you. Tim Ford, retired gunner. What's interesting out of these three presentations is that we're 3 years into the war at this stage, and all the developments are coming together. Everything's sort of working together, and I think there's some fascinating ideas, as Albert said, of what the lessons are today with what that situation is now. But I wonder if you could also talk a little bit about the logistics, because here we have a situation where one very mobile operation and one very static operation, but the logistics, I think, probably had a great impact on it. I wonder if perhaps Roger and John could talk about the logistics behind those two elements.
A large part of my talk was actually about logistics, and I took it out, given that it was more about cracking the nut rather than feeding the nutcracker. It was an incredible problem. You will have noticed on the slide that there was one heavy artillery group that was in reserve. The reason it was in reserve, there was no space in the deployment zone for 1st Anzac for any more guns. They couldn't fit them in. Before this battle could happen, there's a good map in the British official history showing all the heavy and light railways that they had to run into the place. People don't realise, but when the Somme happened, Haig was actually seriously considering not attacking on the Somme, but attacking in much the same place as he does in 1917, up outside Ypres. 2 reasons he doesn't. One is the French connection, the need to work with the French. But the other big one is that Plumer's own recommendation, and Plumer's the garrison commander up there, that garrison at part of the front, and he says the infrastructure is not here to support even a 1916 size army with all of its artillery and food requirements. By 1917, this is multiplied by orders of magnitude. And so before you can even consider this, there's this huge logistics effort to build roads, bridges, railways, canals, airfields, the whole thing. And even then they run into problems. Some of the shell allocations, if you look at the war diaries, there is very careful allocation of shells. You know, the big guns, that 15-inch Royal Marine artillery howitzer is allocated to 4 rounds a day in the pre-attack barrage, and because they simply can't shift those size shells up. Another problem is a lot of those artillery pieces, the heavy ones, are railway mounted. So if you've got a railway gun sitting on your railway line, you can't then run supplies past it. So there's an awful lot of work gone into building passing loops and deployment areas for the railway guns. That takes up more room, because the railway gun takes up a hell of a lot more space than, say, a 6-inch howitzer. And then the shell dumps take up an awful lot. And then you've got food. We're talking 2 armies here. In Belgium's not a big country at the best of times. This is a very small part of Belgium, and most of it's occupied by artillery. So where the hell does the food go? Where do the troops go? The rear zone stretches almost back to the canal. It's a massive logistic effort, and I don't think people fully understand. Those big shells, some of them weighed anything up to 2 tonnes. You can't move those on a Belgian muddy road in a horse-drawn vehicle. You've got to build logistics infrastructure to shift it. And that was a major impediment to a lot of the fighting. And the other thing is, having made the decision to fight the battle there, you then can't, in a hurry, change your mind and fight it somewhere else. So when the heavy rain does fall in Broodseinde, and everyone says, why didn't Haig call off the battle and move it somewhere else? Well, it's not that easy, because he's got to go and then build all that infrastructure somewhere else. So he's basically committed. By the time you make the decision to do the fight and then build all the infrastructure, that's where the fight's going to be. Doesn't matter what happens to change your mind.
In the Middle East, it's a curious blend of the old and new in lots of ways. Gaza Beersheba is planned for several months. The British Army has been stuck in southern Palestine since essentially being defeated at Second Gaza back in April. But in that time, they've been expanding the railway network. It's a hell of a lot more primitive than what you would find in Belgium and France, but they have a railway with connection with Egypt. They're trying to improve that, duplicate it where they can, and that enables them to bring up a lot of supplies and stores and for guns as much as anything else. So there's a lot of stockpiling. And if you look at what 20 Corps does southwest of Beersheba early in the day, the scale is different because there is nowhere near the number of particularly heavy guns. But if you look at the field artillery, it's exactly the same field artillery allocation as you would find on the Western Front. So there's something like 96 18-pounders and 30-something or other 4.5-inch howitzers are being used to support. But there's only probably 8 60-pounders or something like that. So the same sorts of logistic arrangements are being undertaken there. And if you look at the program of fires, indeed, it's very much, it wouldn't be out of place on the Western Front apart from the sort of lower ferocity of it. But when you're looking at what the Mounted Corps is doing, because they're doing that large sweep around to the east of Beersheba, it's kind of much more old school. It is relying on battery ammunition columns. It reflects, and this is a kind of a counterpoint to AL, I suppose, different theatre, different environment, different enemy, different force structure. Actually, if you look at what the mounted troops are doing, it relies a lot on pre-war doctrine. And the pre-war doctrine sees them through the entire campaign. In fact, after the war, this is not a gunner thing, but of course all the doctrine is starting to be revisited, and as the cavalry start sending around circulars, say, well, what do we need to update in cavalry training? And Allenby basically writes back and says, nothing. Cavalry training 1912 is fine. So it's a very different thing. For those mobile batteries, of course, the problem they've got, particularly when they're taking on an entrenched enemy position, is you've got to conserve your ammunition. You've got to be judicious in how you use it and save it for the right moments in the battle, because if you sit on the side of the hill popping away 2 rounds a minute all day, pretty soon you've got the limbers are going to run out, and then the first line's going to start running out, and your nearest supplied dump is 10 miles that way, on the other side of where the enemy is. So you do, and at Rafa at the beginning of 1917, some of the batteries actually do run out of ammunition and have to go out of action.
I'll just add a comment too. I meant to add a comment, and it's a good lesson for coalition warfare. One of the problems that they had in building up the logistics supply in Belgium was that the railways were still run by the French, and the French still gave priority to French military trains, not British military trains. So in some parts of the war diary, you'll find complaints from the logistics officers saying we can't get, because they required something like 240 trains into the Ypres sector per day just to run ammunition in, and they were complaining that they couldn't get the train numbers in because the French had an army up on the north flank and they wanted to be supplied as well, and the French were looking after those. So liaison with your coalition partner is a very important part, particularly in the logistics areas.
Yeah, former junior cavalry officer among all the artillery people. In the Middle East, one of the issues with cavalry and artillery in a combined arms situation is fire control or coordination of that. Can you comment on how they managed to do it in that situation between the light horse and the artillery batteries?
Yeah, again, it's still rather old school. Again, if you look at, there are, in Palestine, you see blends of the old and the new. So if you look at Megiddo, the Megiddo offensive in mid-September 1918, which is the big offensive, it's planning, the way it's put together, the way it's structured, apart from the fact they push a cavalry corps through the gap and it actually does what a cavalry corps is meant to do, would not, in terms of the actual breakthrough battle, the way it's organised would not be out of place on the Western Front. Again, the ferocity of the artillery is less because they don't have as many guns, they don't have as many heavy guns. But again, when you look at the Mounted Corps, because of that requirement for mobile operations and the ability to break up your formations for specific tasks, there's not that artillery centralisation that you see on the Western Front. Yes, there's a GOCRA at divisional, and you know, there are those senior artillery officers, and there are times when they are bringing their 13-pounders and 18-pounders together to take part in some sort of larger artillery plan, and Megiddo is a classic example of that. But on a day-to-day basis, it's a lot more down to the battery commanders and the artillery brigade commanders, who are just, you know, actually attached to the brigade or whoever it is that they're supporting at the particular time. And when you're looking at the communications, yeah, there's a certain amount of air communications, but a lot in the Middle East is, again, it's old-fashioned. Telephone, radios do start to show up, particularly in 1918, but I don't know how much they've been used for the artillery. But again, it's telephone line and a hell of a lot of flag signals and heliograph. And in fact, the guns that are firing at Tel El Saba, at Beersheba, their fire becomes effective as they're coming up to the final assault. It becomes more effective because there's literally an officer standing on a ridge with signal flags directing the fire.
So that was acting as a fire control officer?
Yeah, a fire control officer, but using signal flags. And heliographs used a lot in the Middle East as well. So yeah.
Thank you, John. Paul Stevens again. Can you say a few words about the Turkish artillery and how that might have, how effective that was?
Look, the Turkish gun, the Ottoman artillery at Beersheba, for example, is a real mix. There's Turkish gunners, there's Austrian gunners, who tend to be forgotten, and there's German gunners as well. It's funny, there's at various times the enemy, you know, the Ottomans weren't slouches. They were quite reasonable at their job. But people time and time again, particularly officers, people who come from the Western Front, would often say that, you know, they could do things in Palestine that they could just never get away with in Germany, in France or Belgium, because the Germans would just blow your head off, whereas the Ottomans weren't quite so ruthless, or hard-nosed is perhaps a better way to put it. But, for example, at Beersheba, early in the morning, Chauvel he literally drives up onto this ridge, this hill, which is going to be where he's going to set up his corps headquarters. Literally drives up in his Rolls Royce, gets out, all the staff officers pull up in whatever they're in, and they all start spreading over this hill. And Ottoman artillery observers go, oh, that's interesting, let's take a shot at that. And according to the accounts, it was a bit like a staff ride suddenly being broken up very rudely because there's binoculars and maps and everything flying everywhere and everyone's scurrying off the hill. So there was certainly, I mean, you know, the British infantry attack southwest of town, 1,200 casualties that day. A lot of that was from Ottoman artillery.
I'll take an opportunity. David Connery, and my interest as Director Joint Doctrine is talking about the dissemination of knowledge, and particularly across the Western Front. Can either of you talk about how did that occur? Did it tend to go back more central, then be disseminated out, or was it just going more laterally, informally, formally? So what kind of method did they have to learn while they were doing their doing operations?
That's an incredibly complicated question because it was a very complicated situation. The first thing people don't realise is that the lessons learnt was an industry on the Western Front. If you look at the war diaries, there is a massive amount of lessons learned material included, not just by themselves, but the French and the British exchanged lessons learned information. The Germans exchanged lessons learned information with the British and French unintentionally. So when documents were captured, they were translated, and in fact a lot of British artillery doctrine later in the war draws heavily on German reports on how to avoid the effectiveness of British artillery. So that's the source for the information. The British Army, I used to like to think of the BEF as the second largest city in the British Empire in 1916, 1917, and it's got an education centre. And the education centre is running an incredibly complicated and complex system of schools. So you've got schools for, you know, basic, what we would call basic, recruit training and IET training and collective training. You've then got a number of schools behind corps or run by corps in corps zones to teach sort of specific skills needed for use in that particular area. and they do temporary doctrine development. But then back in the UK, in the War Office, they've got Doctrine Office. They've got a Director of Staff Duties, I think he was called, and he is still, and he's got all these various directorates, as those folks who've been in the Army for a while would remember. And the directorates are busy taking all this lessons learned material that's feeding back from the front, turning it into doctrine, and then churning it out again and sending it out to the schools, sending it out to the deployed forces themselves. It's a massive industry. And part of the problem was in the early days when they were doing this, a lot of the stuff that was being sent back and being incorporated was already out of date. So by about 1917, BEF headquarters, what's his name, Ivor Maxey, British general, is put in charge. I think it's late 17, early 18, is put in charge of looking at the whole British approach to preparation for the Western Front, and that includes training, doctrine, hardening before you get there and all that kind of stuff. And he runs a complete education system from top to bottom, fully integrated. And all it's designed to do is produce soldiers who are efficient on the Western Front.
Yeah, just to add to that, because I agree with everything that Roger just said. But the learning loop or the adaptation cycle is very fast and very freewheeling. So battalions in the line would come out and write their own lessons pamphlet up and have copies printed and distribute it. And other battalions might take it on. So there was a lot of uncontrolled adaptation occurring in the line, and then those ideas that were essentially sound would percolate and then enter the official system, and eventually emerge from London as part of the stationary series publications. Or into the schools that are being set up, and so you have to think of it as being rapid and driven to a great extent by those with the frontline experience, and then the organization being very receptive to implementing changes, which I think is quite the opposite of what many people think of the BEF.
And I think that, not just for the BEF, and I'd actually like to reiterate that point, I guess, in a way, we tend to think of the war as being an eternity, but it's only 4 years. Anyone who's got a kid here knows how quickly 4 years goes past. And if you look at the way the war pans out on the Western Front, really by 1917, everyone understands it intellectually. By the time of Passchendaele, and particularly by the end of the year, everyone's figured out how to fight the war. They just haven't quite perfected it yet. But pretty much everything that gets done in 1918, which will either lose or win the war, is being tried out on the battlefields of 1917. And it's not just the BEF, but also the French and to the Germans to a degree as well. You really have to give them credit for their ability to learn and adapt actually fairly quickly to something that, whilst, yes, they kind of recognised the problem as far back as the 1880s, they'd really only been grappling with since the end of 1914. And if you look at the Western Front in particular, you're actually talking about just a couple of fighting seasons, because every winter the thing shuts down. So it's actually a pretty impressive achievement in lots of ways. I'm sure if you're in it, it feels a hell like a long slog, but yeah, from an institutional point of view, it's actually not that bad.
Any more?
So last one. In regards to this lessons learning centres and the schools and that sort of thing, I mean, really how effective were they? They don't seem to be war winning or anything like that. I was in the Somme last year, and one of the museums we went to, it actually had essentially an account of a typical day's attack. And they'd all wake up, they'd do their morning ablutions, and then they'd all get ready, and then someone would blow the whistle at 7 o'clock. Well, if you've been to that part of France, at 5:30 in the morning, the sun's up and blazing in light. 7 o'clock, I mean, gee, there doesn't seem to be much lessons learned there, sort of thing, I'm just wondering how effective this really was, though.
I'd be interested to know what attack after 1917 happened at 7 o'clock in the morning. But there were, it's not a simple explanation like that. Before you can go in for the attack, you've got to register your artillery. In the days before we had accuracy for map shooting, you had to register your artillery. So bad weather might delay an attack because the artillery hasn't registered on its targets. So you couldn't launch the attack until your artillery was accurately hitting what you wanted it to hit. As they found in the Somme, if you didn't do that, then it didn't matter what the hell the weather was, you get killed. So that's one of the reasons you can be delayed. But mostly everybody understood the arguments about attacking at dawn, or not even attacking dusk. But there are good arguments both ways. Before Men in Row, there's a huge argument about whether they go in at 5:30 or at 3:30. And the problem was the Australians were saying go at 5:30 because we've got to do an advance march up from behind Ypres, through all these tracks, and we've got to move an entire division, well, 2 brigades forward. It's just going to take too long. We couldn't be there consolidated and ready to go by 3:30. It had to be by 5:30. So it's slightly after sunrise. Sunrise is about 5 o'clock at this stage. At the end of the day, it made no difference. It was a mist, but you couldn't rely on it. But there are so many other factors that come into it than just the simple, obvious statements. And the big one is very much the demand of all the supports. So if dawn's at 5:30 but there's a mist or a cloud and the aircraft can't fly, you might put the battle off because you need your spotters up. So you might wait and see what your meteorologists tell you about whether the mist's going to clear. So you might defer the attack for half an hour, 5 hours, something like that. In 1916 at Fromelles, for example, everyone criticises the command because it goes in at 6 o'clock at night. Rather than originally, when it was supposed to go 2 days earlier, it was going to go in at dawn, but it goes at 6 o'clock at night. And one of the reasons for this is the weather has stopped the artillery registering on the targets, and they know they haven't destroyed all particularly the wire entanglements. So they need to keep firing, and they need the daylight for the spotters to see it. Then there's the big argument too, of course. If you go in at night and capture your thing, it gives you the dark to consolidate when the enemy counterattack divisions are not as efficient. So there are lots of arguments either way. Eventually, trial and error, they come down to it that the least worst option is attacking at dawn. And so by 1918, it's very, very rare. I can't think of any offhand major attacks that don't go in at dawn, except for one, I think, on day 2 or day 3 of the Battle of Amiens, where they go in at 10 o'clock or something, and the Germans have gone back to sleep thinking there won't be another attack, and it happens. And that's when they've actually broken through and they're dealing with some of the garrison divisions further back who aren't quite as sharp. But there's deception which comes into it. But again, deception is something you can't do too often or it ceases to be deceptive. So all these factors come into it. It's really not a simple question. And when you go and read the war diaries, these are not stupid men. These are pretty clever. Most of them are pretty smart officers, and they've got an insurmountable problem. It's not until 1918 that the science of the attack equals or exceeds the science of the defence. And I keep saying, remember that the Germans were the masters of the chemical industry before the war. Their concrete is better than ours. If you want to see that, go to just outside Ypres at Hill 60. There's a captured German pillbox on which the British built another pillbox facing the other way when they captured it. The British concrete's rubbish. You can see it now. It crumbles. It's got big rocks in it. The reinforcement's not particularly good, not very dense. Underneath it, there's a German pillbox, which is in pristine condition nearly 100 years later, because the Germans built damn fine concrete pillboxes. So there's a whole... I mean, that's a bit of an aside. But I guess in this, you've got to realise that the British understand these problems, and they're trying to work a solution around it. And it's not the obvious one, usually.
And it's a big problem that requires incremental solutions. And so, that problem gets to get broken down into little series of smaller problems, and each one has to be solved individually. And, at the same time, you're requiring nations and soldiers, armies, to adapt or to try to understand what an industrial age war means. And yes, there were previous examples. Some people go back to, why didn't they learn from the American Civil War? Why didn't they learn from the Russo-Japanese War? Because these should have told them, it should have given them a better insight. And those arguments have some validity to it. But they were now having to face industrial age war for the first time. And with that density of troops and that density and the ability to sustain those numbers of troops and provide them with the ammunition they needed. It was going to take time, and it was going to cost lives. And there's no good answer there. It's just the way it was.
And if you, I mean, you mentioned the Somme, and I'm not sure what particular action you're referring to, but if you look at the British Army on the Somme in the 1916, the British Army of 1916 is an army of neophytes. That is the first year, effectively, that the BEF has really joined the war. Okay, it's been on the Western Front, but it has, the stuff it's done in 1914 and 15 is just holding its bit of the line and undertaking minor offensives. The Battle of the Somme is the BEF's first big show, and it shows. And the British, there's lots of Jeremy Clarksons running around looking down the nose at the French, but the French are looking down their nose at the British as well, and they're saying they're a bunch of amateurs. And in 1916, they are. If you look at the AIF in 1916, it's not real good. And the AIF reflects the wider British Army, British Imperial Army.
And of course, when the Yanks get to the war, they're also neophytes, and they've got it's an accelerated learning curve for them, but they still have to go through that learning curve to make that transition to, industrial war.
Thanks, Al. That's a very rich discussion, and I'm loath to draw it to a close, but I am conscious that the time is marching on, and of my promise to you at the outset that we would wind up on time.